this video we're going to look at the compatibility choice of firms. Often competing firms have a choice about whether to make their products compatible with rivals or incompatible. It can be quite profitable to have a proprietary standard like Windows, but often two or more standards compete for a market. So as an example, we've had Betamax and VHS. They were competing in the video cassette recorder market. And in that case, VHS won, but Betamax was unsuccessful. And in that case, because we had network externalities and they were strong enough, people largely abandoned Betamax, and VHS was the one standard that remained. So more generally, people may abandon one standard when the other gets a substantial installed base. So it can be risky to make your product incompatible and enter into a standards war. So the question is, should a firm choose to be compatible or incompatible with a rival's products? So what are the considerations? If a firm chooses to be incompatible, then there's a chance they'll end up empty-handed, but it could be that they end up winning the standards war and become the dominant firm. There could also be significant costs from a standardization war. In order to win the war, firms might have to invest a lot of resources. They might have to sell their good at a loss for some time in order to try and build up their base, so there can be significant costs. On the other hand, if the firm chooses compatibility, then there's no standardization war, but then there's no chance of becoming a monopolist. There will be tougher competition in the product market. And there's also the consideration that some firms might be stronger than others or have a stronger product than others. So the trade-off also depends on relative strength of the firms. Our model will be symmetric, so it won't take account of differences in relative strength. As well as the Betamax and VHS example, other examples where there are incompatible standards, we have macOS and Windows. In that case, both of the standards have survived, although Windows is dominant. And likely that's because these two standards are differentiated enough that those who prefer macOS aren't going to switch to Windows just because of the greater network benefits, because they prefer the design of the operating system. And then the third one there, Blu-ray and HD DVD, again that's very similar to Betamax and VHS. There was a group headed by Sony that produced Blu-ray, and then there was Toshiba that produced HD DVD. HD DVD was the first to the market, but Blu-ray won the standards war largely because they incorporated it into the PlayStation 3. But in this case, both sides spent significant resources in order to try and make their format the winner. There are also cases where the firms decided not to enter into a standards war, and one example of that is DVD, which came between VHS and Blu-ray. In that case, although there were two groups of firms which came up with slightly different standards, they decided to get together and choose a single standard. So they avoided entering into a format war. In order to model the situation, we are going to use a standard setting game. In this game, there are two firms or two coalitions of firms called A and B, and they can decide to produce one of two incompatible versions of a network good. The two versions are called alpha and beta. And compatibility can only be achieved through standardization, so by producing the same version of the good. So if both firms produce alpha or both firms produce beta, then they're choosing compatibility. Whereas if they choose different versions, one chooses alpha, the other chooses beta, then they're choosing incompatibility. So we have a payoff matrix here with no payoffs. We are going to look at two different versions of this standard setting game, and the payoffs are going to differ in those two versions of the game. In scenario 1, we're considering the case where there is intense standards competition. So there's going to be a lot of effort and resources spent to try and win the standards war. So in this case, let's think of a situation where the compatibility battle is won by the firm that spends the most resources. So these resources could be spent on advertising or initial discounts or anything else that they think will improve their chances of winning the standards war. In this scenario, in the second stage where the winning firm is selling their product, they get the monopoly profit, but the other firm, the firm that lost the standards war, gets zero profit. So we can think of the first stage as an auction. They're going to be willing to bid up to the monopoly profit in order to win. So both firms are going to end up with a zero profit, and possibly less, regardless of whether they win or lose the battle. Now, it's not too crucial exactly what these payoffs are when they're incompatible, it's just that in this scenario, they're going to be low. If the firms choose to be compatible, they choose the same version, then they share the product market and they each make their duopoly profit, pi d. So what are the Nash equilibria of this game? Well, if we look at firm A, if firm B chooses version alpha, what will firm A choose? Well, they're comparing pi d to 0. Pi d is at least as large as 0, and so they will choose to also produce version alpha. Similarly, if firm B chooses version beta, then firm A will want to choose version beta. And since the game is symmetric, firm B will also want to produce the same version as firm A. So we have two Nash equilibria where each firm produces the same version. If pi d were 0, like in the Bertrand game, then anything would be a Nash equilibrium. So what we get out of this game is that if the standards competition is intense, so that the profits in the case of incompatibility are quite low, then the firms are going to prefer to be compatible. So this might be one reason why the firms in the case of DVD got together and decided on a single standard rather than producing the two versions that they had come up with separately. Perhaps Sony had learned something from its war in the Betamax versus VHS case. Now, scenario 2 is the case of weak standards competition. In this model, we're going to assume that the winning standard is random. So consider the model of path dependency we looked at. In that model, if half of the consumers were a fan of each product, then it's equally likely that each product wins. And so the second stage payoffs are going to be as follows. If the firms choose compatibility, then just as before, they get a profit of pi d each. Whereas if the firms do not agree on the standard, then one of those standards is chosen with probability half and gets the monopoly profit. The other firm loses and gets a profit of 0. So choosing to be incompatible means each firm is choosing a lottery. They get pi m or 0 with equal probability, and the expected payoff of this is half pi m. So here we have the payoff matrix. The only differences from before are the bottom left and the top right payoffs. So now let's think about firm A's choice when firm B chooses version alpha. Should they choose version alpha or version beta? So they're comparing now pi d and half pi m, and let's assume that half pi m is more than pi d. This is an inequality we've seen before. It says that the monopolist profit is more than the total duopoly profit. So this is something that will usually hold as long as the product market competition is sufficiently intense in the case of the duopoly. Under this condition, firm A prefers to be incompatible, and similarly firm B prefers to be incompatible. So the Nash equilibria are alpha beta and beta alpha. The condition on the relative profits pi m and pi d can be interpreted as it's better to be a monopolist half the time than a duopolist all the time. So it's better to take the chance of becoming the monopolist than take the sure profit of being a duopolist. So what we've seen looking at this scenario is that if the standards competition is weak, in this case it was determined by chance, and product market competition is sufficiently intense, then the firms prefer incompatibility. So summarizing what we found from looking at these two scenarios, the choice of whether to be compatible or incompatible largely depends on how intense they expect the standards war to be.